On September 13th, 2018, a Nintendo Direct was let out for the world to see. As always, it brought in millions of viewers to check out what exactly Nintendo had planned for the upcoming months. After a full day of anticipation growing and excitement rising, the Direct started with the reveal of a sequel that just about nobody was expecting, Luigi's Mansion 3. My attachment to the Luigi's Mansion series isn't the craziest or anything, but I do really like the games. I haven't played much of the original for the GameCube, but I can tell from what I did play that it was excellent. However, I did play through Dark Moon, and I still stand by my claim that it is severely underrated. So, as a fan of the series, I was pretty excited about this reveal. And now after a year-long excruciating wait, it's out, and I've been able to spend some time with it. So let's take a look at if this game lives up to the quality of the first two, or if it's become a successor to Hotel Mario.
Oh, wow, sorry.
Speaking of hotels, that is exactly where this game happens to take place. It all starts with an opening scene of Mario and the gang riding along on a bus. After some chaos resulting from a Toad of all people being the driver and several uncomfortable Luigi noises, they arrive at the last resort, the destination for the lovely vacation they've planned. In the hotel lobby, we're introduced to the owner, Helen Gravely. Yes, I like that, good job. Along with several incredibly intimidating ghosts posing as the hotel staff. This whole setup is really just a fun welcome to the mayhem that's about to begin, but it's also a shining example, right from the get-go, of how great this game's graphics are. The animations, the lighting, the expression. Everything is so polished and feels so alive, while also maintaining a sinister tone that sticks out in every environment. I can say, at least personally, that this is the best looking Switch game yet, bar none. I played a decent chunk of this game in handheld mode, and the entire time I was just in awe of how they could have possibly made this game work on the console. Anyways, Luigi wakes up to Peach's moaning during the night, finds out that King Boo is working with Helen Gravely to turn the boys into paintings, narrowly escapes to the bottom floor, and finds the new and improved Poltergust G00. Goo. You get a surprisingly short tutorial with Polterpup that introduces the new mechanics, and you're off to explore the hotel and save everybody. Although you're technically not done learning everything you need to know to move on. After you get used to the very basics of combat and get yourself nice and situated with the controls, you stumble upon a painting holding Professor Gadd, and Luigi uses his dark light device to get him out. The following section of the game is dedicated entirely to helping him set up his laboratory in the lowest levels, and it's a nice and subtle way of getting you prepared for the rest of its features. My one main issue with all of these
new devices
is that they're instantly handed to you within the first hour of the game, and I often found myself frantically juggling between them at some points early on. Eventually I was able to overcome my initial confusion, but I still would have liked it if they had spread out the abilities over the course of the game. So after helping out Gadd, the tutorial section of the game is basically over. From then on, it's just moving up, floor to floor, for the rest of the single-player offerings. So what do you do in between these advancements? While there's a lot of minute details I could interject here, I think it's better to classify them under two larger categories: exploration and combat. Let's talk about the latter first. Combat in Luigi's Mansion 3 is easily the most complex it's ever been in the series. Whereas the first two games suffered at least slightly from a lack of depth, this game takes the ideas from those two games and translates them into more involved gameplay, while also remaining reliably consistent across encounters. Take a look at the original Luigi's Mansion. I don't think I have to point out that this is just about as basic as you can get. Flash your light, start sucking, and the encounter is over. Now look at Dark Moon. It's the same for the most part, but there's a new factor of strategy introduced by having the player reduce the health of the ghosts even more with one swift suck. You could even upgrade the Poltergust later on, something I'll get to again in the later section, and it would allow you to charge up the ability for even longer. This addition didn't really have a point, but its inclusion in the game added some subtle variety to the formula. Luigi's Mansion 3, however, takes this even further. Instead of having a short period of extra Luigi can slam the ghosts he's currently fighting into other ghosts in the room. This one detail adds enough to make gameplay way more engaging, and makes for some utterly chaotic fights where you're just throwing ghosts all over the place. It also adds some complexity where you're forced to have legitimate priorities in the middle of a fight, even though most of the time you can kinda just do whatever you want and it'll work out. I don't think I ever actually died in the middle of a simple encounter with the typical ghost you face off against for the majority of the game, so it's not like anything extremely challenging pops up. In terms of boss fights, they're really hit or miss for me. You have standouts like the pianist, the magicians, and the utter perfection that is the fight with the movie director. Easily one of the funniest and most charming bosses from any games I've played this year. But you also have duds that aren't bad necessarily, but they fall short of being memorable in the end. A lot of people have complained about the janitor from the Boiler Works section, but I personally didn't have any issues with completing him. Sure, the controls aren't as tight as they could be, but the difficulty didn't take too hard of a spike in my eyes. That brings up another slight issue with a few of these fights. I can remember multiple times when I had to repeat the same sequence over and over again, for no other reason than uncomfortable maneuvers that the game was expecting me to perform. Most of these problems came up when having to aim a projectile into a very specific location, which isn't as easy as it sounds considering how janky the controls for that can be. I'm not trying to use this as a critique against the game as a whole, since only a few of the bosses suffer from this, but it would have been preferable if the controls were better laid out. What all of these bosses do share, however, is the extreme polish in animations and character that are present in this game's cutscenes. After some disappointingly bland designs in Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, it's great to see that the series is returning to what is essentially the portrait ghost of the original, at least in terms of presentation. Exploration has also changed quite a bit in this game, most notably in structure. The often disruptive nature of Dark Moon's missions has been combined with the original game's far more lax layout to create what is, in my opinion, the perfect balance of the two. The Last Resort is divided into a total of 17 floors, which makes for surprisingly fast-paced movement from level to level. Each floor houses multiple rooms containing a mix of smaller combat, puzzles, and an absurd amount of cash. After reaching the last room, usually behind locks of many types, Luigi fights the boss and nabs the elevator button for the next floor. The puzzles are almost always very simple, more about understanding your moveset instead of unfathomable brain power. There are some more observational puzzles though, and those reward you with either one of the floor's gems or money. Both the gems and the money are satisfying to get, but neither serve much of a purpose. The money can only be used in Gadd's shop, and the products he's selling are just not very useful at all, unless you really care about collecting every gem in Boo. The only thing of interest to you will be the extra lives. And even then, you're probably not going to need those either. At the beginning of the game, I assumed that I would be needing several, so I went ahead and bought about 4 or 5, figuring that when I ran out, I could just come back later. I never came back. So yeah, the shop is basically useless, unless you plan on having the endgame content handed to you right from the beginning. The music's a bop though. It's pretty disappointing coming from Dark Moon, which lets you buy new upgrades for your Poltergust, pushing for the player to be much more involved in looking for the currency, compared to this game's lack of motivation. I still enjoyed collecting money, perhaps just because I enjoyed how responsive and creative the smaller details of each level were. It's very redeeming to poke and prod with all the objects in a level, and finding something in an odd place that you questioned on your own is just a great feeling. The main issue I take from the exploration aspect of this game is that progression gets a little repetitive after a while. There are of course exceptions to this, like Paranormal Productions, which has a structure that is set up so well, I don't want to spoil it for anybody. Still, the majority of the floors follow such similar setups with the conflict of, uh-oh, Luigi found the button, but what's this? The ghost happened to swoop it up, that it gets tiring by the end. It's still a formula that works, but when it's used so frequently without much variance, it sucks the fun out of some scenes. As is usual for this series, the story isn't very fleshed out. Other than the setup I talked about at the beginning, nothing crucial happens other than the gradual check-ins on Helen Gravely getting angrier and angrier at her employees and Luigi. The only time any other big event happens is the final boss in the ending. I won't show anything of it, but I will say that it was slightly disappointing. All the build-up over the course of the game culminates in a pretty decent string of fights, but I was expecting a lot more. So the main campaign is pretty great, but what is there to do beyond that? This game actually has a lot more to offer in terms of replay value than I expected. You of course have the gems for each level, but there's also plenty of Boos scattered across the hotel, just like in the previous games. Hunting them down is a lot of fun and makes quite a compelling argument to come back once you're done with the base game. But beyond the single-player offerings, which already take up a decent chunk of time, there are 2 multiplayer modes to try out as well. The Scream Park is a collection of minigames for local co-op with your friends, based around the moves that the Poltergust is capable of. I haven't played it yet, I'm still missing one of the requirements, but it looks like a somewhat entertaining, albeit ultimately forgettable party game. The Scare Scraper though, that's my bread and butter. I've always had a soft spot for this game mode, and I sunk way too much of my time into it playing it on my 3DS. But you may be wondering, asking me, that's you, what is this Scare Scraper you speak of? Well, it's a game mode where you and a handful of other players are dropped onto a randomized floor and work together to capture all the ghosts in the given time. It's really not anything special, but the simplicity of the multiplayer is entirely to its success. The combat here is much more difficult than basically anywhere in the campaign, with the exception of a few boss fights. Having a more demanding playstyle can make this mode incredibly addicting, which is why I've been somewhat holding myself back from playing it. And while I haven't been able to play too much of it, I can tell it's just as fun as it was in Darkman. While Luigi's Mansion 3 may have its issues here and there, overall it's still a great game with a lot of fun to be had. In comparison to the previous games in the series, it holds up very well, and I'm sure I'll be looking back at this game just as fondly as the others. In all honesty, when this review is uploaded, I'm probably going to be heading right back in to get more collectibles and have a great time doing so. Sucking up ghosts and exploring mansions hasn't lost its charm here, and I'm happy to say that my hype leading up to this game was well worth it. Alright, I think I've covered just about everything for this game. Let me just make sure and check over my handy notepad app